My name's Avaes Mohammad.
And what do you do?
I'm a poet, a playwright, a performer, and everything else that's needed to go alongside that.
And where were you born in? In the UK?
I was born in Blackburn, in Lancashire, in the north of England.
And you grew up there too?
Yeah, I grew up there. I was there till I was 19, in the same area, around Wally Range area, and moved when I went to university when I was 19.
And how did you get involved in South Asian theatre?
I got involved in theatre. I always had an interest in theatre since childhood. I was always the one involved in the school productions and all the typical stories that most actors and people involved in theatre tell, except that in Blackburn there wasn't really much of an opportunity to do anything with that. There weren't drama clubs that were very well. I mean, there was a drama club that I used to go to, but there wasn't a sense of progression from those. There wasn't much of a network, or people who did go to such activities didn't actually intend to make a career out of it. And our school also didn't even provide it as GCSE, so I felt a little that interest I had, there wasn't much of a provision for. So I didn't really do much with it, for lack of resource probably, until I went to university. And after I'd done my bachelor's and went back for a postgrad, I decided if I was going back to the same city to go back to university, then I'd do something more proactive with my evenings and weekends. And I joined Contact Young Actors Company at the Contact Theatre, and various writing schemes, and I had frequent open mics, and just explored my creativity. And it was through Contact Theatre and the schemes that they had there, which was quite a hub for the North actually. In a way it's quite a hub internationally as well, with their Contact in the World festival. I suppose that's where I became networked and schooled in theatre.
And what did you do before you went into theatre?
I studied chemistry. I did a bachelor's in chemistry, and then I went on to do a PhD in analytical chemistry, both at Manchester. And so by the time I'd finished my PhD, I'd had plays commissioned and toured. I'd had stuff on radio. So I had a choice of two careers. And for a little while I did them both. I carried on writing to commission and worked as a chemist after completing my PhD. And then chose to focus on just the one.
Which one?
Theatre, writing, poetry.
And the content of your work, was it very British South Asian? Did that have any meaning for you?
It did have a meaning by default, in the, one of the major reasons that I started writing was the events around the summer of 2001, where in the north there were riots between young British Asian youth and the far right, which also spilled onto the police. That spread like a flame actually from Oldham to Bradford to Burnley. So it started going off like matchboxes, really, just all over. And then obviously 9/11 happened at the end of that. So I felt as though the reason I started writing was because of the way these events and the community I was a part of was being represented. I felt as though that community hadn't previously been represented by mainstream media. And this was the first time it was even being acknowledged and talked about. Prior to that, I'd felt as though we were just a silent community, really, that nobody really talked about. And we were just left to our own devices, and it was questionable whether we even existed or not. And the first time we were being talked about were as terrorists or rioters, disaffected youth kind of thing. So yeah, I remember one night talking to my flatmate and saying, you know, we can't just have these people talk about us. We need to talk about us. Um, and so yeah, that's why I started writing. And so by default, it was, I suppose, British South Asian because I wanted to talk about my community. I wanted to talk about my experiences, and that's a British South Asian community. I grew up in a very British South Asian area in Blackburn. So yeah, I suppose by default.
So which South Asian community was this?
Well, that's an interesting question. I uh, I like to keep that as broad as possible, partly because I'm a minority within a minority. My parents and I speak Kutchi. Kutchi is a minority language within the British South Asian kind of demographic. It's comes from the region of Kutch, which borders Pakistan, but it's an Indian region in the northwest of India. And but my father was actually born in Karachi. My mother was born in Mombasa, in East Africa. So already I was born with three, you know, the cultures of three countries. I spoke the language I spoke an Indian language. My father was very Pakistani in his politics, in his outlook, and his culture. And my mother was very East African in her politics, outlook, and culture. So I already had a very broad sense of what it meant to be South Asian. Added to that, I grew up in a community full of Gujarati Indians and Punjabi Pakistanis and Kashmiri Pakistanis. And so, you know, what it meant to be South Asian to me has always been very open. And I am I'm equally comfortable in all, I feel, all of the myriad of faces it has.
So do you consider the British South Asian theatre as a reflection of a particular style, a particular area of work?
I mean, that's a strange question. British South Asian work for me is any work that's done by British South Asians. And that's a huge diversity there. Culturally, also politically, and, you know, type of work people do. So does it reflect any particular area? You know, by default, just because there are more Punjabis in British Punjabis in Britain, a lot of work has, you know, a British Punjabi aesthetic in music as well as in theatre. But that doesn't mean that, you know, British South Asian work is only British Punjabi or that's the only cultural makeup. I think there's room, and there always has been diversity. So it's difficult to say which particular community British South Asian work caters for.
So within this diversity, would you say there's a common thread between the stories?
For me, the common thread is just people wanting to express what life means to them, you know? And that's the common thread between all work, really. But obviously, British South Asian work, when you use that term, is viewed from, to me, it's a cultural phenomenon, you know? It's a cultural / political phenomenon. It's just interesting to see how these group of migrants who share a particular cultural outlook and particular cultural values have chosen to articulate their lives in Britain from the 1950s, 60s onwards. That's interesting to me.
And your own artistic journey, how did that evolve? I mean, you've spoken briefly about it, but perhaps you could let us know in more detail how that happened?
So yeah, I mean, it was, as I say, I suppose the stars aligned in that I was going back to the same city to study again, doing a postgrad, and I knew I wanted to explore something different, and so I already knew that I wanted to express myself creatively. Coupled to that was, you know, this changing political landscape and the questions I was made to face with that, around my identity and the way I was perceived, and the people I loved, how they were perceived. So I had the reason, the motivation for writing, as well as the will for writing and performing at the same time. Coupled to that, again, was I suppose the fertility that the schemes that Contact Theatre provided. They were very open to young artists at the time, and I think I took advantage of that. And Manchester was also a very easy city in which to be an artist, I feel, because it's quite small, and you get to network yourself really well and meet other artists. And I feel as though my time in Manchester was really about discovering and nurturing my creativity, as well as my politics. So a lot of things just came together at the same time. Initially, I wasn't quite sure what I was interested in. You know, I used to write plays as well as poetry, as well as act, as well as be in a band. And I think it's, you know, with time, it's whittled down to mainly writing scripts for stage and screen, and also performing poetry with occasional acting work, and I'm quite happy with that for the moment. Yeah, so I think my creative journey has also mirrored my political journey as well, in that, you know, initially my work was very political, and still is. It was in response to 9/11 and the riots, and it, you know, arguably still is. But as I've grown and developed into understanding, you know, how to resist that prejudice and discrimination that came with the aftermath of 9/11, I think my art has grown with that as well. I think initially possibly it was easy just to be the angry young man, but with time I think, you know, you reflect more, and I think I've realised that the politics needs to reflect the individual journey also, and things aren't always so black and white. That's been interesting because it's allowed a deepening within my creative journey.
And how's that in the relationship with your family and friends? I mean, going into this creative world and working in it for a livelihood.
That's been interesting because I had the option and had previously earned you know, what you'd call a respectable livelihood, and earned, you know, decent money, I suppose. And I've chosen to leave that and go into a career that doesn't necessarily provide you with as much money as easily. So that was interesting for my parents to try and understand, but I think they do now, which I'm quite fortunate about. But initially, of course, it was a shock to them, and they couldn't understand why I'd spent so long at university only to abandon it to do something else entirely different. And you know, that's natural. You've got to respect that. But I think with time, they've seen my passion and my dedication to what I do, and they also like my work, and they can see that, you know, I am still able to make a living for myself. So I think, yeah, they're as supportive as they can be.
And they come and see your work?
Yeah, when they can, they do, yeah.
Were they themselves involved in any theatre at all when they were younger?
My mother not, but my father was. My father wrote Urdu poetry and acted when he was in Karachi. So, in a way, even though he was probably the more hesitant initially, I think I reminded him of himself. And yeah, I think he's able to support me because of that.
Now, you talked about the riots. Was that in any way a great and traumatic experience for you?
Yeah, because I think I was in my early 20s, around 21 or something. And life had been relatively easy till then, you know. It was, yeah, I didn't understand when my father used to sometimes say that one day they might ask us to leave. And he'd say that quite a lot while I was growing up. And I never got it. I thought it was, just paranoid talking, and it felt quite divorced from the reality I was living, until the riots and until a latent racism that you suspected or you felt was in the air. Because Blackburn's very divided as well, so you don't really have much interaction with white people growing up there. So it's difficult to tell what their opinions are of you. It's very easy just to live within your own bubble or ghetto or whatever you want to call it. But then with the riots happening, I suppose the greatest tragedy to that, for me at least, was the open articulation of the prejudice people felt. The open articulation in local and mainstream media towards South Asian youth. That was a shock. It was a huge shock, because suddenly the land and the country and the life I felt very comfortable in, I didn't feel comfortable in anymore at all. And that's, in a way, more difficult for my generation than it is for my parents' generation, because my parents' generation have a home that they come from. They have East Africa or South Asia. For me, I didn't have that. I know that I'm not East African and I'm not South Asian. There's a prefix to that, and the prefix is Britain. And if I'm made to feel unwelcome here, then I don't have anywhere else. Is how I felt at the time. So yeah, it was a huge shock. It was massive.
So how have you addressed that over time?
I'm not quite sure, because, a question like that I think takes years of therapy to understand. I think if you were to ask me now, part of the way I would address, my reflections on national identity now are such that I don't care for it. I don't subscribe to any national identity. I'm not a nationalist or a patriot of any country in the world, but I'm equally of every country in the world. I think maybe that's how I square my circle, is that I feel comfortable wherever I am. And the way I see it is that if I'm stood on any patch of land on the earth, then it's mine because I'm stood on it, And if it's able to support my weight, then it's home. So I've travelled extensively since 9/11, all around the world, and the riots, and I think that's made me feel more, citizen of the world than anything else.
So would you say your background's actually equipped you for transnationalism?
My background with my parents, you mean?
Yeah, where they've come.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, both of them are transnational, even to themselves, to each other, I mean. Because my father is from Karachi, my mother's from East Africa. That's two very different experiences and identities. And so I grew up with two parents, who looked similar, who spoke the same language, but actually were very different culturally. And I was, again, looked similar, spoke the same language, but very different culturally. So for me, it's very normal and natural to be transnational.
So it's actually part of your life.
Yeah,
really.
Yeah, and it's probably one of my most favourite features of my life.
Great. And tell me about the audiences that come and see your work.
It depends on what the work is. Some work is typically, it resonates with British South Asian audiences or Muslim audiences, because I've done a play about, say, Guantanamo Bay, which a lot of Muslims came to see. But at the same time, a lot of, lefties came to see, and a lot of anti-war people came to see, and a lot of people just interested who in what Guantanamo Bay was came to see. I think, I write my work because I initially am my own audience. I need to hear this or explore it. So the only constant is me. The only constant member of the audience is me. With each piece of work and with each night even, the audience shifts, and so it should, because we live in such a diverse community, diverse society. it's difficult to have a particular audience that comes to see my work. I'm quite lucky. I think a lot of I get a broad makeup of people come to see my work.
So when you do your work with different theatre companies, do they market your work to particular audiences or not?
I think they do. Fields of Grey, which was a play last year, just over a year ago, at Contact Theatre in Manchester. That was about a British Pakistani mujahid, jihadi fighter who'd gone to fight in Iraq, and an African American soldier in Iraq. And the premise was that they just shot each other and they wake up in this room, and the room is a theatre, and they don't know what they're doing there, and they don't know who the audiences are who are there watching them. That was marketed particularly to the British South Asian and Muslim community in Manchester. But it was also marketed at anti-war protesters and people on the political left. That was interesting, and we got a healthy makeup of both kind of sets of people in our audiences. It was also marketed at Americans because one of the characters was American. So yeah, I think all work, when it's culturally specific, is marketed obviously to that culture. But I think, there's also there are other levels of resonance also that, it doesn't just stop with what language these characters speak or where they come from. I think what values those characters bring on stage as well, that's also another market set for the work to reach out towards.
And what would you say is the relationship between the content of your work and the everyday lives of people?
The filter is me. Whether it is actually relatable to everyday lives of people, and I think it is, but it's not meant to be, in a way. That's not my primary motivation. My primary motivation is understanding it for me. So I'm writing a play at the moment that features a group that starts off. It's a huge long play for Red Ladder Theatre Company, but it starts off at least with a group of 4 Asian young lads in their late teens in a car, and obviously that reflects, it should at least reflect the lives of young Asian men, up and down the country, young British Asian men up and down the country. But I'm writing it because I want to write it, if that makes sense. So I'm writing it because it should reflect something for me first. It should reflect some of my own experience or some of my own values and what I want to say about the world. And almost as a default, yeah, of course it should reflect the lives of everyday people. But it's not. I suppose what I'm saying is my work's not documentary. It's not there to necessarily reflect the lives of everyday people. It's there to reflect the world as I see it.
Would you describe yourself as an everyday person?
Yeah.
So it is everyday.
Yeah, I suppose in that sense, yeah.
Great. And now a lot of people felt that they were not connected with theatre, especially those people in the rural areas. But you actually come from an area that doesn't have much relationship with theatre, from what you've just said. So how do you see your work being experienced by those people?
It's interesting because obviously I've got the advantage of having friends there still. So when my plays are in the Northwest, I always invite them. Always invite my friends and they invite their friends and such. And so I do tend to get a little audience from Blackburn as well. And also with my poetry, I've performed in Preston and Burnley and Blackburn. It's because it's such an under-catered for area. It's the reception of theatre and my poetry is is quite an emotive one, actually. You know, it's quite it's certainly appreciated, but it's, I don't know how else to put it except that it's emotive. People are always welcome the opportunity to come and see the work from these areas, because they don't usually get the chance to.
And how you've touched on this about your work evolving, and it's really an examination of yourself. If you look back on this, and say your first work to the work that you're presently writing for Red Ladder, what is that difference there? What's that trajectory?
You know, since then, on paper at least, you could say it's quite diverse, in that my first play was about the Bhopal gas disaster, which is an Indian phenomenon, an Indian event. The second play was In God We Trust, which was about Guantanamo Bay. Since then, I've written about asylum seekers in England, child sexual exploitation, Asian youth writing against police, and also recently with Fields of Grey, this kind of purgatory situation between a British Muslim jihadi fighter and an African American soldier. But it seems relatively diverse, but I feel as though I've been caught up for a long time with examining the events of 2001. I feel as though I haven't really broken that bubble as yet, because I've needed personally to understand that as much as I can, or I don't know, have some kind of cathartic kind of release from it. The play I'm writing at the moment for Red Ladder, Hurling Rubble at the Sun, is a three-parter, told in one play in one evening, that looks at how British Muslim extremism has developed through the eyes of the communities, using 9/11, 7/7 and Woolwich as time markers. I feel as though, you know, my work in a way has been has had, you know, the riots and 9/11 and the war on terror at its core, and, you know, at its core examination. But the way I've examined that has developed. The way as my outlook has developed on it, and I'm hoping that, you know, this big play I'm writing now for Red Ladder will hopefully, you know, 12 years on or 13 years on, however long it's been, provide me that cathartic release. I'm hoping to go in. I mean, I'm hoping this one to be quite a big play, and just to use this as an opportunity to let go a little bit, and say what I need to say, kind of in a big flash. Yeah, I think that's how it's developed.
When you say it's a big play, in what sense do you mean big?
Length and the fact and scope, because it's, you know, it's looking at the development of British Muslim extremism from 2001 till today. It's using these events of 9/11, 7/7, Woolwich as three distinct markers, each with its own play, and looking at how communities were affected by these events. So in scope and in length and breadth.
So you're part of the theatre of today, because you're actually writing work and producing work. And how do you see your work sitting in the rest of the state of theatre today?
Well, British theatre is a wonderful thing. I think we're really quite lucky to be living here, in that there's so much variety and so much excellence as well. You know, some of the plays I saw just last year, like Chimerica, were just incredible. How it sits within the scope of the British, you know, theatrical landscape, I'm not. I mean, personally, I feel as that's not a question for me to answer. I think that's what academics do, or possibly reviewers do. I don't look at my work and within, through the lens of a canon or anything like that. I just do it because I need to do it. But if I was to take that liberty, I'd say, that Britain has a tradition of political theatre, or theatre that engages with the social state of affairs. And I think that my work does that and has been doing that for a while. And possibly it sits there. But yeah, I'd welcome anybody else to study it and tell me.
But your work is actually quite a direct result or response to actions that have happened around you, situations. Do you feel that other writers, other theatre producers in, say, the South Asian sector are producing work like that, or do you feel that their stories are perhaps maybe a little bit different?
It's strange, South Asian, to consider it like that, because everybody's equally individual, and there's always going to be crossover. People are always going to want to, write similar things. But I do believe that if you got 12 writers in a room, but you gave them exactly the same pitch to write from, you'd get 12 very different plays. And that's the beauty of, the individual artist bringing his or her experience to the page. So yeah, there's always going to be crossover, and perhaps there are writers who are doing similar things, and there are also writers who aren't. People write for their own reasons, but even if it's no threat, I feel as though it should always be a mutually supportive endeavour, really, because as many voices as you get, none will ever actually mirror one another, because that's the beauty of being a human being, is that everybody's so uniquely individual.
And do you think that the kind of educational workshops and activities with participants helps this kind of support to be built up?
Yeah, I think, especially within the writers, people are really supportive to one another. That my peers, who I consider my peers, people like Ishidin and M. Hussain, Satina Chauhan, there's a wonderful resource there that we know we can call each other whenever we want, when deadlines are failing us or the pressure's mounting. And that has come from doing workshops together or being commissioned by the same people, being at the same events. So what was your question there?
Whether participants, and I didn't mean the other fellow professionals, but people that make up the public.
Uh-huh.
Do you think workshops and activities like that, educational activities, helps to create support for your work? Because you basically write the work for yourself, so that has to translate into how it is reflected with other audiences or with audiences, and how it's then absorbed by them, taken in by, accepted by them. Do you think these educational workshops are really fundamental to creating that kind of acceptance and understanding?
Yeah, I think so. It helps develop an audience, it helps develop understanding. I think that's a good thing.
Really, I'm just saying, how important is it compared to, a writer writes alone, basically. Then the work has to be shared. It's that transition, really, thinking.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it always helps to have these workshops, but at the same time, the work shouldn't necessarily have to be explained. It should just stand alone and work. Perhaps if it's of a specific cultural context, but even then, I don't, within cultural specificity, that's probably the most potent means by which to achieve universality. So there isn't, I don't necessarily feel there's a need, although it's to be welcomed. I mean, why not, have workshops around productions? I think it's a good idea. It helps increase understanding on this kind of stuff, and also allows the audience to have a different experience over and above just being a passive observer. But I don't feel as though the work itself should be dependent upon these workshops. They should stand alone.
So talking about standalone works, which of your works do you feel are kind of integral markers to your own development?
All of them.
All of everyone?
Yeah, all of them. I mean, all my poems and plays, they're flags on my life, aren't they? They reflect how I was thinking and what I believed in at the time, and what was important to me, and what my loves were. And I don't know, I mean, obviously the first play you ever write, or the first poem you ever write, takes some beating, because the thrill of that will never be matched. But at the same time, each play I write brings its own thrill and its own beauty and challenges. I'd never be able to choose between any play I've written as one that stands out, over and above the rest.
So no desert island plays?
Wow. A desert island play of my own that I had to be alone with. I'd find it probably the one that needed the work most, like needed working on the most, so that I'd have something to do on the island. So probably my current play. At the moment I'm most excited about what I'm writing. I think that's probably true. I'm always most excited about what I'm writing at the time. And at the moment I'm writing Howling Rubble in the Sun for Red Ladder Theatre Company, and I'm very excited about that. I think that's, for my moment, my most exciting play, because it's not done yet.
So to end up, is there anything important that you'd like us to know that you feel we haven't covered yet?
No, I mean, I just welcome this project. I'm really pleased to be a part of it. And it's, I think it comes at a really exciting time. And I'm really glad to be amongst the diversity of British South Asian theatre practitioners, It means so many different things for so many different people, and nothing to some. And all of that is part of its diversity. But as I think I said at the beginning, for me, I just find it interesting how people who have had similar cultural backgrounds to myself, and perhaps similar social conditions, and similar struggles growing up, of identity, for example, how their work has grown from them. I just find it's just an interest, and I'm glad for my work to be amongst them, because there are some incredible artists who have created some beautiful work that are part of this project, and to be amongst those names is wonderful.
Thank you for your time, Avaes.
Thank you.